on the air with the new move to try to get your gas prices a little bit lower. And it's a move that's making history, with President Biden unleashing 180 million barrels of oil from our strategic reserves over the next 6 months. So when will me and you and everybody else in America actually see lower gas prices? We've got the gut check coming up as a new report shows inflation heading up again. Plus, lawmakers on the January 6th committee getting the lowdown from Jared Kushner today. Why they think he's got some good info on what his father-in-law knew, even though Kushner wasn't even in the country when the Capitol attack happened. And 2 people are dead after more than 24 tornadoes ripped through the South. We're live on the ground, and we've got to look at where this storm's heading next. Plus, here's maybe a new one for you. Why accusations of cocaine-fueled Beltway sex parties have one GOP freshman on the ropes. His own party, kind of over the drama, is shown by one powerful Republican today, announcing he's going to back one of Madison Cawthorne's primary challengers. That's a lot. We'll break it down. We'll also break down a new battle in the war over how schools teach kids, so-called social emotional learning, what that is, and why some think it might turn into the next critical race theory in tonight's original. Hey, I'm Hallie, and today you've got President Biden taking another shot at trying to make the gas station a little less stressful for a lot of us by releasing 1 million barrels of oil every day for the next 6 months from the U.S. strategic reserves. This is an underground stockpile of oil that the U.S. builds up for emergencies. And apparently the president thinks that is what we are in, with prices going up and a war in Ukraine. And he's pushing for oil companies to do more, too.
It's time to step up for the good of your country, the good of the world, to invest in immediate production that we need to respond to Vladimir Putin.
We said it was historic. It is. For context, the U.S. has only done this a few other times, during the Gulf War, during Hurricane Katrina, and during the Libyan civil war. None of those times came close to the amount of oil the president's putting out now. And look, he hopes it's going to get record high gas prices under control. The national average, $4.22 a gallon. That's 50 cents higher than last month. In California, yes, it is almost $6. And on top of all that, today, the monthly inflation report showed another jump. So look at how much prices have risen in the last year for a whole bunch of stuff. 8% more for food, 25% more for gas. It is the highest jump in these kinds of prices since Return of the Jedi was the #1 movie in theaters. That's a long time ago, gang. I want to bring in Shannon Pettypiece. And Shannon, talk about this move from the White House. It's going to bring the reserves that we have down by about 1/3. So why is the president doing this now at this moment?
Well, I mean, Hallie, you look at those price increases you just put up there. These high gas prices, they haven't even started to trickle down into the economy, into areas like food production, because oil is involved in fertilizer. You have transportation costs of the trucks that transport the food. So this persistent high price of oil is only going to sort of spread through the economy. And so that's why we're seeing the president take this action today. Over the course of the next 6 months, the U.S., as you mentioned, is going to release about $180 million barrels. And to put that into context, though, the U.S. uses about 7 billion barrels of oil a year. So 180 million out of 7 billion that is used. So it is a small number relative to the amount of oil we consume, but it is a very large amount to be released from this reserve, one of the biggest amounts that's ever been put out there. And the president is hoping that this will be what he calls a bridge, a wartime bridge, to help ease the prices a little bit until the U.S. can up domestic production. And that there is a big sticking point for the White House, because they are trying to put pressure on U.S. domestic oil producers to up their production, and really calling them out and trying to shame them publicly for not using some of the leases and drilling permits they have on federal land. The oil industry says it's a lot more complicated than that. They said it takes years to put some of these leases into place. Sometimes they get a lease on land and it's not viable to drill it. And there's a lot of other pressures that have been going on in the oil industry right now. Pressures from investors, pressures from environmental groups, even supply chain and worker shortages that have been holding them back. But the administration is looking to the domestic producers longer term to sort of bridge this gap in what could be months of disruption from oil coming from the Russian market.
Real quick, Shannon, there's another piece of this, too, to try to help out companies who make electric vehicles, with the president saying he's going to invoke the Defense Production Act for stuff like lithium, right, which makes the batteries for those cars.
Right. Long term, the administration sees the solution to this as reducing our need for fossil fuels. Of course, this is an administration that came in wanting to do less drilling on federal lands, wanting to reduce the use of fossil fuels, and now they're calling for an increase of it. But as you can see through this action with the Defense Production Act, trying to encourage more domestic production of these materials that are used in these batteries that are essential for electric vehicles, because ultimately that's what the administration sees as the ticket out of dependence on foreign oil and fossil fuels.
This really hits at the heart of what people care about right now. Our brand new NBC News polling shows right now the top two issues for folks in this country are costs, the cost of living, and jobs and the economy. Most Americans are blaming the high cost of all this on either COVID, on companies, or on the president himself. But you've got the White House, Shannon, really hoping to pin the blame on Vladimir Putin. They are really trying to say, and we heard this from the president, it's Russia's fault for all this.
Yeah, Putin's price hikes. That's what they are trying to say here. Now, most Americans know the price of gas was already rather high before all this happened, but it has certainly shot up to levels not seen in decades. So the administration trying to take off some of that heat, but Republicans are seizing on this and trying to, if not specifically blame the president for the price of gas, which some of them are doing, to just try and paint an overall broader picture of a country where people just feel a little unstable and use that going into these midterm elections.
Shannon Pettypiece outside the White House. Thank you. Let me bring in Pippa Stevens, a CNBC energy reporter. Pippa, we're so glad to have you because you know this beat so well. I think the big question on a lot of people's minds is, okay, the oil reserves, we're going to see a million barrels a day. When am I going to feel that impact when I go and pay for gas myself?
Hey, Hallie, well, as the saying goes, prices go up like a rocket and down like a feather. So any relief that we see probably won't come for another few weeks. And a lot really here depends on the direction of oil, which is a global market and tied to what goes on between Russia and Ukraine, as well as what happens in China. They are the world's largest oil importer. So any soft demand out of China will then bring oil prices down. So when we talk about what does that mean at the pump, I had one expert tell me that he thinks prices will come down by about 10 cents in the next 2 weeks. Right now, as you said, the national average is $4.22. I had another person tell me that he thinks we will break below $4 in the next 2 weeks. So really, the next few weeks here are key as we see what happens out of Russia and out of China.
There's this talk about a gas tax holiday, right, that some states are looking at, Maryland, Georgia, for example. Democrats in Washington, not so much pushing for it. We heard some cold water on that from House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Would it actually help? Keeping in mind that the federal gas tax, I think, is 18 cents, right, per gallon that we pump. Is that something that could make a difference here to give us some relief?
Well, it might make a difference in the short term, but we have to also not lose sight of the longer term. And any short-term fixes are not addressing the structural issues in the market, which is one of underinvestment, undersupply. Producers scale back production in the wake of COVID-19. And out of that, they've kept their output under wraps while demand around the world has bounced back. So any short-term relief here is not going to lead to demand destruction. And demand destruction is, in fact, one of the things that experts say could meaningfully bring down prices. But when we have short-term, artificial measures, but like a potential gas tax, relief of the gas tax that prop up prices in the short term, we have to think about what does that do over the longer-term trajectory.
Pippa Stevens from CNBC. Pippa, great to have you on the show. Thank you. You heard the president blame Vladimir Putin for this and his war in Ukraine. So let's talk about that war in Ukraine, because today the Red Cross is scrambling to get folks out of Mariupol. That's the city where Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, says thousands of, in his words, peaceful residents have died. We here at NBC News can't confirm that, but we do know that 17 buses full of people did manage to get out of Mariupol today. The city council says about 80,000 people have managed to escape so far, but thousands are still stuck there. They don't have food, many of them. They don't have water. They don't have power. And it's even worse in Kharkiv, where Ukrainian officials say Russia is not letting anybody get out through these humanitarian corridors that are supposed to be open. And officials locally say Russia's still bombing big time. Nearly 4 dozen strikes in just the last 24 hours. Ali Arouzi is in Lviv, Ukraine. And Ali, we heard from President Biden. He was at that gas event, took a couple questions on Vladimir Putin and the war, and was really clear that he is so skeptical, right? Has seen no evidence that Putin is actually pulling back troops from the Ukrainian capital. This seems to be, in the words of, for example, NATO, even the Pentagon, a repositioning as the Russian troops steps up air attacks.
That's right, Hallie. And not only the NATO, Zelensky himself, Zelensky's commanders are all saying that there's been very little military movement away from those areas since they made that announcement. They said that they were going to scale back the number of troops they had to build confidence, a mutual trust between the Ukrainians. Instead, they kept shelling these cities. There was heavy fighting outside the suburbs of Kyiv, where they really are very strategic areas that the Russians want to take. And as you mentioned, Kharkiv is another disaster zone that the Russians are opening up there. They're bombing civilians there. They're reducing buildings to smoldering wrecks. And what's interesting, Hallie, is that, Kharkiv is a majority ethnic Russian population there. It's very close to the Russian border, but that doesn't seem to make any difference to the Russians destroying that city. And they're following the same pattern that they've done in besieged places like Mariupol. They're encircling it. They're not letting food and supplies get in there. There's no running water in there, and the civilians are at their wits' end. I think we've seen some amazing reporting from our colleague Richard Engel in there showing just how bad the situation is, especially for some of the elderly people there. So it's just this pattern of brutality from the Russians in city after city in this country that's just getting pounded by them, but they still keep fighting back. We just heard a message from Zelensky just before we came on air here that they are pushing the Russians back from the areas around Kyiv and Chernihiv. So they are putting up a fierce fight everywhere they go. And that really does underscore how the Russian military might is not exactly what they envisaged or what anybody else envisaged before this war.
Vladimir Putin is watching that resistance. As President Biden suggests today, he's getting increasingly self-isolated, basically. And now there's this new pushback from the Kremlin today on this idea that Putin is being misinformed by his advisors, this intelligence that was declassified by U.S. officials yesterday.
That's right. But, anything the Kremlin spokesperson says comes straight from Vladimir Putin. So that's no surprise that there's a pushback from Peskov. But he is probably a little bit isolated. I mean, we heard Putin say last week that no conscripts are being sent to fight here in Ukraine. Not only have they been sent to fight here, they're dying here. So all of these things clash with what Putin has said last week, and that makes him kind of look bad. They're apparently misleading him about the effect of sanctions on his country and how isolated it has become and how badly the military operation is going. But I've got to tell you, Hallie, I find it a little bit odd that Putin is so in the dark about this. After all, this guy was an ex-KGB agent, right, and that was his job to know about these exact things, how the war efforts are going, how the troops are doing on the ground. So it seems so weird that he wouldn't know how badly this war is going, especially as you and I know how badly this war is going for the Russians.
Ali Arouzi and Lviv, it's a good point. Thank you so much for being on with us tonight, for being live on the ground there. Back here at home, 2 people have been killed after a tornado ripped through one county in Florida as part of this really bad weather that's hitting the South and the Midwest. Look at this. We're going to show it to you, the aftermath of homes. I mean, those aren't homes, right? Those are piles of sticks. That's how bad this tornado was. 2 people were killed. 27 tornadoes have been confirmed since these severe storms started. You saw them touching down in Florida, in Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, Alabama, Missouri. Besides tornadoes, we're talking about really strong winds, not tornado level, but really big gusts that ripped roofs off homes, businesses, schools were destroyed. Trees, as you can imagine, picked up, put down other places. Blaine Alexander is covering this for us tonight. So, Blaine, talk to me about what happened in Florida's Panhandle, where these 2 people were killed. What else do we know?
Well, Hallie, we know that it was a suspected tornado that touched down there in Florida. It happened during the overnight hours. Now, of course, that's always very dangerous because it's when people are most likely asleep. It's when people, you really can't see tornadoes as well. So certainly very dangerous. But there's something else that officials really throughout the path of this storm have been saying as to why it's so dangerous. And that's because it is moving so quickly. We've been kind of tracking this storm through a couple of different areas here across the South. But most recently in Jackson, Mississippi, officials there were putting out the warning about 3 hours before the storm was set to hit, saying, listen, this is going to be on you very quickly, and as soon as it gets here, you're not going to have much warning. So they were telling people early in the day to find your safe space, find your area where you can go and take shelter. So that was one of more than 24 suspected tornadoes that this storm is producing, Hallie.
You're also looking at severe weather where you are, widespread damage in at least 7 states. Talk to us about what some of these folks are facing.
I think there's two big things. One, we talked about the speed, but the other is just the wind. You know, of course, more than 24 reported tornadoes, but also those really, really strong winds. We are seeing homes destroyed. We're seeing businesses destroyed. I was in eastern Louisiana earlier today. The roof was completely torn off of a K-12 building there. Now, that was some place where if there had been children inside, it could have been a completely different story. I went inside, I mean, completely soaked, things just tossed all over. A lot, almost 3/4 of the building just almost needs to be completely redone. That's one of the things that we're seeing, but that just kind of shows you the power that this storm is bringing. I think the other thing that's really notable here, Hallie, is just how widespread it is. We're talking about more than 400 different warnings across 16 states. So this really is something that, you know, typically as we see them go, they may decrease in energy, decrease in speed. That hasn't been the case here. That intensity has maintained throughout. Now it's kind of on its final day, dumping rain across the East Coast. But again, still some tornado warnings scattered today, Hallie.
Blaine Alexander live for us there in Atlanta. Blaine, thank you so much. The storm is now moving up the East Coast, right? You got severe weather warnings for Virginia, for New York, parts of Pennsylvania. Let me bring in Al Roker. And Al, we're looking at winds of up to 70 miles an hour. And what is so scary, you know, when Blaine talked about those nighttime tornadoes, how many times have you and I sat here and talked about how dangerous those kinds of tornadoes are, right? That is right. Why it's so scary.
Yeah, twice as deadly as daytime tornadoes. And right now, I can see still a lot of rain down in Florida, but we have tornado watches now from the Carolinas up into central Virginia. And then we also have severe thunderstorm watches stretching from Virginia all the way here into the Northeast, and some severe thunderstorm warnings as this line pushes through. In fact, 51 million people right now at risk. Wind gusts of up to 70 miles per hour, Hallie. A few tornadoes possibly, especially up through, including Washington, D.C., Harrisburg, just to the west of New York. Damaging winds as well. We're going to be watching this closely as this system pushes through. A severe risk for the Northeast tonight for the next several hours. The front will exit the coast by Friday morning, and then we're going to get some wraparound colder air with some snow coming in here. The rain's not the big deal. As Blaine kind of alluded to, we're talking maybe a 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch of rain from D.C. up into New England. The biggest problem, Hallie, going to be these winds, where we're talking about the wind gusts possibly up to 70 miles per hour. But then this system moves through and things calm down, thankfully, as we head into the weekend.
Al Roker with the forecast there. Al, thank you so much. Appreciate that. So the January 6th committee is getting closer and closer to getting details straight from former President Trump's family about what exactly he was doing the day of the insurrection. Today, those lawmakers talking with his own son-in-law, Jared Kushner, also, by the way, a White House advisor, about that attack on the Capitol. The interview started right around 10 o'clock this morning. It was voluntary, right? He wasn't forced. He wasn't subpoenaed to come in. But it does make Kushner the highest-ranking member of the administration and the first Trump family member to show up for this discussion. And while Kushner wasn't actually in the U.S. the day this happened, he was flying back to D.C. from Saudi Arabia, his name did appear to be mentioned in a text between former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows and Ginny Thomas, the wife of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. In this message obtained by the Washington Post, Thomas seems to refer to Kushner saying, "Just forwarded to your Gmail an email I sent Jared this morning," adding, "Improved coordination will help the cavalry come and fraud exposed." Obviously, she is referring to conspiracy theories that have been debunked around the 2020 election. Leanne Caldwell is joining us now. So, Leanne, listen, Jared Kushner was not in the country the day of the insurrection, but the committee still seems to think he's going to have information that will get to them. He is, you know, aside from Ivanka Trump, these are the two biggest names, I think, in sort of that Trump orbit that the committee has called in so far. And now here we have Kushner virtually appearing for this discussion.
Yeah, he is virtually appearing, and we know that we think he is still talking to them.
Now? That's like 7+ hours.
Right. So 3 hours. There's been 3 hours this morning. There was a short break, and then they returned to keep speaking. So there is a chance that it is over. We can't see inside the room, but from the activity from outside of the room, it seems like it's still happening. So we don't know if he's answering questions, if he's pleading the fifth, or if he's providing them any sort of information, or maybe just a little. We don't know yet what's happening. But we do know that he did show up voluntarily, unlike any other member of the Trump family. And so we'll see. I don't know how soon we'll see what was said, but it will come out eventually, Hallie.
Yeah, 7 hours would, or I guess if it's less than that, Leanne, if it was 3 plus a break and then all afternoon today, up into the evening now, feels like it's a long time to just be taking the fifth, right? To be no commenting the committee. I mean, as much as we can infer or read the tea leaves from that.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we can read tea leaves, but we'll see. He also has very expensive lawyers, and there could be discussion about that as well, or about, you know, these lawyers
process
are good at, managing the process. So we'll see. But it is interesting that he decided to show up. He wasn't in the country. His name is rarely mentioned regarding January 6th. You mentioned that text message, but really his name has not come up a lot. So we'll see what the committee can get from him.
Two people who worked with the former president who are not cooperating with the committee are Dan Scavino and Peter Navarro, right? They're the January 6th Select Committee, as we know, has voted to hold them in contempt of Congress. It looks like that process is going to move forward, this reprimand for these two, early next week.
Yeah, that's right. So the House of Representatives just announced today that they're starting the process of bringing their contempt charges to the floor on Monday. So as early as Monday, maybe Tuesday, that could be voted on before the full House. Then it goes to the Department of Justice to officially press charges if the Department of Justice chooses to do so. We've heard from committee members, especially they got very vocal this week, pressing the Department of Justice to act. They've already acted, pressed charges against or indicted Steve Bannon for contempt. Mark Meadows, they have not done anything with yet. And so once the House votes, which they are expected to pass these contempt charges, and they head to the Department of Justice, the January 6th committee is saying, you got to do something, or these contempt votes don't mean anything, Hallie.
More than 49,000 pieces of debris from last week's China Eastern plane crash have actually been found now. All 132 people were killed on board after the plane crashed into a mountainside, basically. They still don't know why that happened, but officials are saying that at this point, the search for wreckage is over. Number two, a judge has approved an $83 million settlement in last year's condo collapse in Surfside, Florida. Anybody who owned a unit in the building is going to split that money for property loss. This was horrific. Remember, 98 people were killed in the collapse. No word yet on a settlement for victims' families, by the way. Number three, a new NBC News poll shows 1 in 5 of us in this country are getting into crypto. We're using it, we're trading it, we're investing in it. Biggest group, men ages 18 to 49. They're the biggest dabblers, with supporters saying Bitcoin and Ethereum are quicker and safer to use, they think, than regular cash. Number four, environmental officials hope the birth of a rare rhino in Indonesia could help save an endangered species. Check out Rosa, little baby Sumatran rhino newborn. Only about 80 of these kinds of rhinoceroses left in the world. She's the first birth of the species at that sanctuary in a decade, so workers there, you know, they are excited. They're glad to be taking care of her. Number five, Blue Origin launching its 4th successful space tourism mission earlier today. 6 people were on board, an engineer, and then 5 people who actually paid for the flight. The rocket traveled just outside Earth's atmosphere, going more than 2,000 miles an hour. Now, to a story that I've been following for months, this American family who's been fighting to get their son out of a Russian prison, getting some FaceTime with President Biden, not long after I spoke with them yesterday on my other show over on MSNBC. We're talking about Joey and Paula Reed. They're hoping President Biden can help free their son, Trevor, a former U.S. Marine sentenced to 9 years in prison on charges the State Department says are, in their words, ridiculous. The Reeds came up from Texas this week to demonstrate in front of the White House for Trevor's release, and then ended up inside that very building, sitting down with President Biden unexpectedly last night. Here's what they told me just a few hours ago. Late this afternoon, Joey and Paula Reed sharing what it was like at the White House face to face with President Biden last night. So are you more or less optimistic now about the chances of getting your son out after this discussion?
Probably a little bit more, even though he said don't get your hopes up.
Really? Trying to expectation manage, I assume, for you.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's exactly what I would do in his situation, in his position. And, he doesn't want to get our hopes up, but he did. The fact that he listened to us, and that has to have influenced him. And we're hoping that'll be, to bring our son and the other Americans home. The Reeds, hopeful after the meeting about their son, Trevor, a Texas student and former Marine, sentenced to 9 years in a Russian prison for allegedly assaulting a police officer after a night of drinking in 2019. Charges Reed has denied from the start.
I have no idea what their motives would be, but this is clearly political.
His family says Reed, who's been imprisoned in Russia for more than 2 years, is not doing well and has started a hunger strike over his treatment in jail.
Trevor's health isn't going to hold up too much longer.
Because he's on a hunger strike now. He has
on a hunger strike, plus he has, possible TB, and we reiterated that to him, that our son is very ill.
Russian President Vladimir Putin slamming Reed ahead of a summit last year with President Biden.
He's just a drunk and a troublemaker.
But he also agreed to negotiate with the Biden administration for Trevor Reed's release.
And on the prisoner swap question, is that something that you would consider? Are you looking to negotiate? You're meeting with the president?
Yes, of course.
Reed is one of several Americans currently being held in Russia, including Paul Whelan and now WNBA star Brittany Griner. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki saying the administration will keep pushing for the release of Americans like Reed, whose parents just want their son home.
If you could get a message to Trevor right now, what would you tell him, Paula?
Hang in there just a little bit longer. We're working as hard as we can to bring you home.
Paula's eyes, started to fill with tears there, as you might imagine. Her son imprisoned in Russia here. And listen, he's not the only one, as we talked about. President Biden brought up Paul Whelan's case with Putin when the two leaders met last summer. And then you see in the middle here, Brittany Griner. In her case, she hasn't even been convicted yet of anything. And some people associated with the Women's Basketball League have reportedly said they're being told not to make a real big deal about it, her being jailed in Russia, right, so that she doesn't become a pawn for the country. Obviously, we're staying on top of all three of their stories as this coverage continues. Still to come. We're hearing for the first time, from one of the men accused of planning to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer in his trial. We'll talk about the explosive testimony in his own defense next. Plus, controversy, to say the least, over Congressman Madison Cawthorne and some, colorful comments from the Republican lawmaker. Has him catching heat from his party and his constituents. We're going to explain after the break. A new report out from the CDC shows just how hard the pandemic has been on teens and their mental health. We're going to talk about that a little bit later in the show. But first, a series of words I don't think I've ever said on this show. Cocaine-fueled Beltway sex parties. Accusations of them, at least, from North Carolina Congressman Madison Cawthorne. With just today, one of the Republican senators from his state, Tom Tillis, saying he's going to back one of Cawthorne's challengers in his primary. Republicans look like they are pretty over it with Cawthorne. They're kind of done. You have House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy saying Cawthorne lost his trust over this, drug sex allegation thing in Washington and needs to turn his life around to get it back. You saw Cawthorne firing back real fast today with a tweet and a new campaign ad saying he is, quote, not going anywhere. And this, along with other controversies lately, like calling the Ukrainian president a thug right as Russia was invading, seems to be making its way from the Beltway, where sometimes there's drama and it's just Beltway drama, into Cawthorne's district, right? The New York Times talked with constituents, the people who actually vote members of Congress into office. One voter telling the Times he voted for Cawthorne before, he's going to pass this time around. Another saying they are disappointed in the congressman, and yet another saying Cawthorne has his work cut out for him. Joining me now is our Capitol Hill correspondent, Garrett Hake. Not a story we talk about all the time, right? This thing that Madison Cawthorne said about something rather scandalous. Members of Congress were like, we don't really appreciate being lumped into these accusations that you were invited to some, drug-fueled sex thing. You know what I mean? And they're upset. And we're sort of seeing that on a really public scale.
Yes, we are. And Hallie, let me say how thrilled I am to be part of this historic first for Hallie Jackson now, to be able to come on and talk about this today. Yep. Well, I don't know what that says. But look, it is true. I mean, Cawthorne's colleagues are totally over this. I tried to talk to a couple of Republican House members today and got some of the colder of cold shoulders I have ever received trying to ask about a colleague's behavior. They're frustrated by Cawthorne, but whether this will affect his reelection is, I think, a fairly open question, believe it or not, despite kind of how ridiculous these comments were, how much trouble they got them in here in D.C. Remember, this is a guy who won his first race by beating a candidate who was the hand-picked candidate of Mark Meadows and was the Trump candidate at the time in his last primary, and he still has Donald Trump's endorsement, which goes a long way in Republican primaries. It's a big field in his primary right now. There is one other candidate who establishment Republicans are trying to coalesce around, but this may be the kind of thing that Cawthorne Cawthorne can ride out, especially in this version of the House GOP.
And just to get people caught up who are like, what, Hallie, wait, why are you guys talking about this weird like sex thing? Cawthorne made these accusations. He sort of alleged that he was invited to these kinds of parties. And I think members of Congress felt like they were being tainted by this, what they felt like was obviously an inaccurate brush here. But it's not just this. There have been other things that have happened that have been really controversial around Congressman Cawthorne. We mentioned the thug comment. And now you have Tom Tillis, the senator from North Carolina, today saying, I'm going to endorse the guy you're up against. How much of a big deal could that be in the state, Garrett?
Well, this is Tillis endorsing one of the guys that Cawthorne is up against, and that makes a big difference here in a big, crowded, multi-candidate primary. Cawthorne may be able to win a re-election or may be able to squeak through a primary with 20% of the vote or so. And the guy who Tillis endorsed here is a sitting state senator. He seems to be kind of the establishment choice here. If, he can consolidate the anti-Cawthorne vote in that district, it may be enough for him to get through. And, I think the reason you're seeing so many of Cawthorne's fellow lawmakers turn on him here when they haven't turned on some of the other folks who have operated in a similar kind of professional troll-ish manner on Capitol Hill is because Cawthorne brought them into it, right? This was not him talking about, anybody other than himself. It wasn't him out doing something stupid that only affected him. It was him alluding to other lawmakers, presumably Republicans, who were doing these nefarious deeds. And his fellow Republicans sure didn't like even the whiff of scandal that the people doing the cocaine and participating in the sex parties could be them.
Right. That's exactly it. So, when you look at it big picture, Garrett, there is, still this discussion, of course, in the midterms. And this is what experts and political observers say, is that it looks like Republicans have a pretty good shot of taking back the House. I'm not breaking news here on this show, right? No. Like that's what the facts of the matter are. So this Republican on Republican fighting only seems to matter to the extent of who ends up making it through some of these primaries, given that the GOP seems like it has a pretty solid lock. Like a Democrat's not going to win Madison Cawthorne's district. You know what I mean?
That's exactly right. Cawthorne is running in a safe seat. He briefly flirted with running in a seat in the suburbs of Charlotte that would have been much tougher to hold. But now that he's back in his old district, there will almost certainly be a Republican representing this district in the next Congress, whether that's Madison Cawthorne or someone else, and whether they're sitting in the majority or not. All may be part of how this plays out and how Republicans handle these internal scandals that keep popping up.
Garrett Haake, thank you again for this history-making moment on Hallie Jackson Now. It is great to see you, friend. Appreciate it. Thank you, sir. So, to other news now. Daniel Harris, who's one of the 4 men charged with plotting to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, he took the stand in his own defense today for the first time and told the jury he never agreed to this plan to kidnap her. None of the other defendants took the stand, and at least 5 of the other defense witnesses did not testify. They were invoking the 5th Amendment. The defense is now rested already. You might remember Harris, the people you see on your screen, Adam Fox, Barry Croft Jr., Brandon Caserta. They're accused of conspiring to kidnap Governor Whitmer from her vacation home in northern Michigan back in 2020 during the pandemic because they were really upset about the state's COVID restrictions. Megan Fitzgerald is joining us now to talk about this. And Megan, what was interesting here, very aggressive cross-examination between Harris and one of the prosecutors.
Yeah, that's right, Hallie. So we started to see things really heat up when the prosecutor asked Harris about what he thought of those 2 guys who had already pleaded guilty to conspiracy to kidnap the governor. And he used an expletive. He described them as the B word. And so then you saw the prosecutor really leaning into that, saying, well, what do you mean by that? Harris then returning with next question, next question. So not cooperating. There was other line of questioning where he said, I don't recall, or where he wouldn't use yes or no answers. And so this was certainly really frustrating to the prosecution, who said, you know what, just went on the record and said it seemed that he remembered a lot more when his attorney was asking him questions than he is right now. And it's also worth noting that the prosecution said that he really pressed him on this message that he said Harris sent, where he said that he wanted to dress up like a pizza delivery man and kill Governor Whitmer. Hallie.
This was also what we've seen in this trial so far has felt a little lopsided, at least from a timing perspective, because the prosecutors took almost 2 weeks to make their case. The defense has gone and wrapped up in just 1 day, right? You had all these witnesses from the defense decide they want to stay silent. What does this mean, do you think, moving forward as this moves on?
So that's a great question because, I think it's human nature you're sitting there for 13 days, you're listening to the prosecution paint their side of the story. And then when it comes to the defense, you're expecting that they're going to present their side. And as you mentioned, only one of the defendants took the witness stand, and there were 5 others who were supposed to take the witness stand for the defense that took the 5th. But legal analysts say, look, this is something that may be questionable to some of those jurors who are sitting there. But in the end, these jurors have to go with the law. They are obligated to follow the law. They will be instructed to not infer guilt, not to hold that against the defense, because in the end, this is the prosecution's case to prove. Hallie.
Megan Fitzgerald, good to see you. Thank you. Coming up here after the break, tonight's original on what's called social emotional learning and why it's being targeted by some conservatives. And a Tesla crash lands onto an ambulance in California. Oof, how the people inside the car are doing. Coming up in the local. The Biden administration rolling out gender-neutral passports in what is seen as a big move for the transgender community. We'll talk more about what this means as we're seeing the fight for trans rights on both the state and federal levels. We'll get to that in a minute. But first, NBC News covers hundreds of stories every day. And because you couldn't possibly read or watch or listen to them all, our bureau teams have done it for you. This is what they tell us is going down in their regions in a segment we call The Local. From our bureau here in D.C., officials say one person has been killed after a Navy plane crashed off the coast of Virginia. 2 other people were on board. They were hurt but rescued by the Coast Guard. The plane was apparently doing a routine flight before this thing happened. No word yet on what caused it to go down. From our West Coast bureau, San Diego firefighters pulled 3 people from a Tesla. Look at this video here. It crashed through a fence and then landed on top of an ambulance that was like a little bit further down. Do you see that? 2 of those people were taken to the hospital. Crews had to use a crane to try to get the car down. They don't know why the Tesla crashed, but they say it could have been a lot worse if it didn't actually end up on top of the ambulance there. From our Northeast Bureau, the home of the Boston Red Sox is going green. Fenway Park making moves to go carbon neutral by 2050. The team says it's paying for this through ticket sales, which might be a reason for you to go visit the country's oldest major league park. If you like the Red Sox, I'm not going to get involved with that. We can talk football. You know I'm not doing baseball. Some news now. A cry for help. That is what the CDC's acting deputy director is calling the numbers from their latest report on teens' mental health during the pandemic. The agency calling it a full-on mental health crisis. With more than a third of high school kids experiencing poor mental health, almost half of those students saying they felt persistently sad or hopeless. The data is also looking at the effect of what parents were going through and the impact that had on teens. More than half of students reported experiencing emotional abuse in their own homes, with 20% of lesbian, gay, and bisexual students saying they'd been physically abused at home compared to 10% of heterosexual students. If you or somebody you know is looking for help, call the Mental Health Services hotline. It's right here on your screen. It's 1-800-662-HELP. That's 1-800-662-4357. As we talk about members of the LGBTQ plus community, you've got some new policies being put in place on this day of National Transgender Visibility. Starting in April, the State Department will make the gender-neutral X marker available on passports, like M for male, F for female, and now X for gender neutral. We also found out today the TSA is going to put in place some new screening changes to make that more gender neutral. I talked with Assistant Secretary for Health, Admiral Rachel Levine, earlier today. She is the highest-ranking openly transgender member of the U.S. government. Watch. We're in this moment where some on the right continue to publicly misgender you. On a personal level, how do you navigate that?
Well, I am absolutely able to navigate that. I've been doing this a while. But what I worry is how those mean-spirited comments affect other transgender individuals who are more vulnerable than I am, particularly trans youth, who we need to support and to empower in their lives, not to denigrate. So I'm fine, but we have to support others that are more vulnerable.
The moves that the Biden administration is making on the federal level comes after some attempts on the state level to try to roll back trans rights, like that controversial Don't Say Gay law that's now in Florida, so-called, and a new directive by the Texas governor to report parents of trans minors to state officials if it seems like their children are doing elective procedures for gender transitioning. A district judge has temporarily blocked that, by the way, calling it unconstitutional. I want to bring in now Joe Yerkeba. Joe, I'm glad to have you on. Let's talk about some of what the Biden administration announced today. These more gender-inclusive levels at the moves, I should say, at the federal level. The passport move that was sort of long in the works. This new change to what you're going to see at the TSA. How significant is that for members of the trans community?
Yeah, so all of these changes are incredibly significant. I mean, roughly 5 million Americans identify as non-binary or intersex, and that means they're neither exclusively male nor female. And this means, you know, to have a gender-neutral X passport would finally reflect who they are, and that's a huge deal. And then, of course, the changes to TSA policies are also incredibly important because transgender people are much more likely to be singled out for invasive pat-downs, and that's because the advanced imaging technology body screeners often detect anomalies on their bodies, and that can, you know, lead to really embarrassing and humiliating experiences for them while traveling. So all of these updates are going to make a huge difference for trans people.
Are there some limits, though, to what the federal government can do when what is happening on the state level in some of these largely more conservative states is going on with these rollbacks of trans rights?
Yeah, there are absolutely limits. And I think that the gender neutral passport is a good example because in 14 states, you still have to show proof of sex reassignment surgery in order to get your birth certificate changed to have the gender marker updated. And so it kind of raises questions of, even though the federal government can do this and give people a passport that reflects who they are, what does it mean if their state identification is going to conflict with that? What kind of problems could that cause? And the same goes for, you know, inclusive policies related to trans and non-binary students in schools. You know, the federal government can support them, but if their states aren't doing the same, it kind of raises the question, what kind of difference is it going to make?
I had that conversation with Admiral Levine, the first time ever actually she had appeared over on that network, and I guess now our network by extension, about what the Biden administration is doing and about what it means to trans kids, who she had a conversation with along with the second gentleman, Doug Emhoff, today at the White House. And she described it, and I don't want to put words in her mouth, but to paraphrase, is scary for some of these trans kids, what we're seeing in some of these states, particularly at a time, you know, when violence among the trans community is hitting a high.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. You know, today is Transgender Day of Visibility, and visibility is really important. But in 2014, since 2014, the Human Rights Campaign has found that 256 trans and gender nonconforming people have been fatally killed. And in last year, that number was 57, and that was the deadliest year on record for trans people. And I think it's important to recognize that, you know, we can celebrate and people should be visible, but it looks like that visibility is coming at a cost with the political climate, what it is right now, and violence against trans people is only getting worse.
It's an important conversation to have, and we're glad that you're here to have it with us. Joe Yerkeba, thank you so much. We want to bring in now tonight's original with in-depth reporting on a topic we've been keeping an eye on. And tonight it's social emotional learning, this program at school that teaches students mindfulness, helps them manage feelings and show empathy for other people. Think of it kind of like, you know, journaling or meditation. And even though it's been around for years, it's suddenly becoming more and more controversial, and in some instances, a target for conservative groups. Why? They see it as a stepping stone to critical race theory. Vaughn Hilliard takes a look at how schools are helping students with their own social awareness, while some parents are sounding the alarm.
How do you feel this morning, Kaylee girl? I'm happy. This is social emotional learning.
It's all about building the relationships and knowing the child inside and outside the classroom.
Thousands of schools across the country are using SEL practices to help students both learn and cope with difficult emotions.
We come into class and sometimes the teachers will ask us, how do you feel? Are you okay? And then me talking to them will help me with my schoolwork. 19
states have set standards for SEL programs. Across the country, schools and districts have increased spending on SEL by 45% since 2019. March 11th was the second annual International Social Emotional Learning Day. President Biden and the First Lady released a statement in support, but many of the same so-called parents' rights groups that have taken aim at critical race theory and vaccine mandates are now gunning for SEL. The curriculum has been challenged in more than a half a dozen states.
They talk about power and privilege, which are tenets of critical race theory. They also have a very heavy LGBTQIA agenda.
There's lots of research to suggest that if kids don't feel valued in school, if they feel disconnected, they're not going to engage.
Utah Parents United convinced one school district to remove an SEL curriculum after they discovered one of the lessons linked to a website about dating and sex.
What does social emotional learning look like?
SEL has also become a frequent target of conservative media. The Federalist has called SEL a vehicle for anti-white racism, while Breitbart says it's a Trojan horse for CRT. A National Review says it's the next fight in education. But proponents say the decade-old idea has little to do with identity politics and was not previously controversial.
So much of this conversation comes around how do we make sure we are empowering and encouraging students to really use their voice.
To what extent would you argue that it is more important now in a more politically divisive, especially when we're talking about issues of race in our classrooms here today?
It helps us understand different perspectives, like first and foremost, and who doesn't need that right now? I mean, all of us are coming to conversations, whether it's coming out of the pandemic, whether it is political, and it is so important to be able to take a moment and understand not only your perspective, but the perspective of others.
But today's reality is one of friction, again, over teachings in the classrooms where kids are left to be on the front lines of the culture war's consequences.
Vaughn Hilliard joining us now. Vaughn, I'm glad that you're bringing this reporting to us. And what I think is important here, too, is it's not like social emotional learning looks the exact same in every single state, right?
Right. To be clear, about half of the states actually don't have statewide standards here. This is a community to school district decision in so many places here. And again, these are guidelines. These are standards. This is not meant to be indoctrination, right? Is a lot of the criticism you hear on the right would suggest. More so, this is a way for educators and teachers who spend 7-8 hours a day with these young people on a daily basis to be able to better engage with their students about these social issues that are not only surrounding their communities and their schools, but also themselves. To, you mentioned meditating, right? To be able to how to communicate and say hi to individuals. There are, though, some tough conversations. In California, they do have a statewide standard that says, in part, saying students must have an educational experience that is personalized, culturally relevant, and responsive, and intentionally addresses racism and implicit bias. And to be clear, these issues of racism are very prevalent in so many communities, and there are dynamics that exist in classrooms here. And essentially what these standards do is allow these teachers, these educators, to better have those conversations and to better be able to address sort of these social awareness issues that students are undoubtedly facing, especially at the heart of this pandemic and at a time in which we are so politically divided as well.
Vaughn Hilliard, thank you so much for being with us. Appreciate it. And thanks to all of you for watching us this hour. That is a wrap. We're going to have more for you here tomorrow. Same time, same place. Coverage picks up right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.